So Luca's just asked me to talk a little bit about delivery and some of the challenges associated with that. And I've chosen to talk about spatial plans and connectivity. So the four things I wanted to cover briefly this afternoon was the relationship between land use and accessibility. And of course, there is a very strong relationship. And that's set in the context of this urgent housing need. I wanted to move on to the need for bold spatial plans and how these could be linked with the new Department for Transport metrics on connectivity. Then I wanted to finish with some ideas for accessibility-led development and the implications for mixed-use development. So, bold spatial plans have long been heralded as a blueprint for thriving communities. Take, for instance, the 1930s Eindhoven plan, which you're seeing on screen now. This was a visionary plan put together 90-odd years ago, and it was important because it integrated transport and land use planning, and it set a precedent. Yet despite decades of academic recognition, empirical evidence, the practical application of this type of thing is simply not happening in the UK, not least in 2024. Fortunately, we are seeing some positive noises from the Department of Transport. So they have set up a new scientific advisory council. And that advisory council has been studying this whole problem, and this year they have identified that we need generational town plans. So we need to move towards a much more holistic approach to town planning. One of their key takeaways, of course, was the critical role between land use and transport. We all know this, so we travel to get to places, so therefore it follows that where those places are sort of determine how we travel. They concluded that many housing developments were simply in the wrong place, disconnected from sustainable transport and essential services, and of course that has a whole series of consequences. And they called for a paradigm shift. They called for holistic systems thinking approaches, a bit like what we were getting at this morning when we were talking about the kind of failure of local plans and call for sites, etc. So let me tell you a little bit more about the new DFT connectivity tool. So I should point out actually that this plan on screen is actually the tram network in 1930s Brooklyn. I just liked it because it says something about connectivity. So this is a new postcode-based connectivity tool. The Department of Transport have been tinkering this for many years, and there are now strong indications that this will be released at some point in 2025. You would have heard of PTAL before. Obviously, if you've worked in London, our densities, land use are very much governed by the level of accessibility of the PTAL. But this tool, we've been told, is going to be even more powerful because it will bring transport accessibility together with spatial proximity of services. So it's about your ability to cycle, to walk, to catch a bus or a train somewhere, and the system understands what services you may want to access. So it's really about accessibility and proximity. What the DFT hope, and what we hope as transport planners, is if we can think in this way, we can actually create more sustainable patterns of walking, cycling and public transport. And that's really where we're lacking at the moment. We're not creating places that are natural places for walking, cycling or catching buses. So let's move on to levering accessibility. So how do we sort of create accessibility? Well, there are lots of great examples of this actually, and some of these are quite historical. So in 1947, the fine city of Copenhagen introduced the revolutionary Fingers Plan. This was an urban blueprint for promoting city growth along these linear transit corridors. And of course now we know this as transit-orientated development, actually a term we ought to use more. This was clever because it also allowed new residents and existing residents access to green space. And of course a lot of our urban extensions and the like simply cut off existing residents from green space. So when we start thinking bold like this, and with the advent of grey belt land and the plans for large-scale housing over coming years, we do start to ponder what possibilities, could exist in Britain if we thought like this. So let's move on to accessibility-led development. Well, I firmly believe actually that we are surrounded by underutilised infrastructure. Small stations on forgotten branch lines, disused railways, even former trunk roads which are now bypassed. So why can't we transform some of these national assets into these transit fingers to deliver some of the growth that we need? So imagine growth fingers with stations anchoring 10-minute communities, or even taking a Cambridge type approach where they've used guided buses with parallel cycleways and development frontage to create accessibility-led development. But the clever thing about these new connectivity metrics is it's not just about accessibility, it's also about access to services. And this is important because it means that developers can actually lever new services to improve their connectivity. So if they don't have accessibility to other services, they can create their own facilities, and that will influence this new DFT metric. So it's all about co-locating existing and essential features, education, retail, community health and work. And this new metric, I think, is going to have some big implications for how we do development. So that would include brownfield development, which of course has links with existing facilities. It means urban extensions can become more viable, and it means even freestanding garden villages with the right facilities will become properly connected. So in conclusion, our talk is really about building the right homes in the right place. It's about better alignment of land use planning and transport accessibility. We think the forthcoming DFT connectivity tool will have significant implications for plan making. And we think developers should respond as well. So they should be levering sites that are already accessible. But where that accessibility doesn't exist, they can create new accessibility and or deliver new facilities to make their sites more connected. So I'd like to thank you for listening, and that's the end of our talk.